Please briefly describe your role at Siemens.
So I am the president of Siemens Smart Infrastructure in the United States. And Siemens Smart Infrastructure here is a multi-billion-dollar company. And overall, the organization here really combines a variety of business and spans everything from the building side of the house, building management, over power distribution systems in all different voltage levels, low voltage to medium voltage, really all different sizes and shapes. But also includes renewable energy solutions, e-mobility offerings, car chargers, and all the software and IoT technology that you need to connect those parts and pieces. And really what we're after is to be that trusted partner, but also the manufacturer and then the solution provider to our customers that are looking to really take their footprint, however it looks like and wherever it is, like in buildings and industry, on the utility space, customers that are looking to make their footprint more efficient, more resilient, and more sustainable.
How does Siemens Smart Infrastructure USA fit within the larger company? And why does Siemens have a smart infrastructure division? And what does that mean, the smart infrastructure part? And what does how does infrastructure differ from smart infrastructure in your opinion?
So to your first question, smart infrastructure is within the organizational setup of Siemens overall, one of the three entities that we call operating companies. So there's smart infrastructure, then there's digital industry, and the colleagues in digital industry, I guess the name says they focus more on industrial customers, so more on process industries, manufacturing, and really digital solutions, both PLCs, HMI solutions, and software solutions for this customer group. The third leg for us is Siemens Mobility, and that is rail transportation, but also traffic controls, everything in the transportation realm. So now to your second question, why do we have smart infrastructure as an organization? And smart infrastructure is fairly new in the organization and was created and established back in 2019. And the rationale behind the formation of smart infrastructure is that we're really seeing changes in what our customers are looking for. And there's quite a few of those. So let me just walk you through them. Then this is, again, our perspective. But first of all, customers, they're looking for cost improvements. They want to drive energy efficiency in their buildings. They want to get operating costs down. And one way of doing that is to really get increased transparency into what's going on in your infrastructure. Secondly, I guess we just saw in Texas when the lights went out and power went down, resiliency is becoming more and more of a topic, specifically as we see more of these storms coming through. So there's a lot of customers that are looking for ways, again, to lower cost, but also to get a little bit more independent from the grid and also find renewable sources that help with sustainability goals and reduction of carbon footprints. Tenant experience, comfort levels, tenant safety. Still, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so there's a lot of empty buildings that are sitting out there and a lot of companies that are trying to get their employees back into the building after having worked from home and having enjoyed the convenience of working from home. So tenant comfort, that user experience of operating and really working out of a building, is becoming increasingly important for our customers. And touching on safety, overall, the tools that we have today, IoT technologies, they really allow us to provide tenants, operators, building owners with a lot more data. That helps them, on the one hand, to manage people flow in a building and think about COVID. How nice would it be to know, where are people congregating? Where are people really, hanging out so I know where to clean? But also in case of an emergency evacuation, what if I could route my evacuation routes based on where people are in the building, where people are crowding, to increase safety. So there's a lot of things we can now do with technology that we weren't able to do just 10 years ago. And last but not least, buildings are an expensive asset. So the more data we can provide on what people are doing in this building and the more business revenue we can generate for building operators along those lines, the better. And this can be as basic as providing tenants in a building with information on parking that's available, on what the cafe around the corner has on the lunch menu, dry cleaners, train schedules. I'm like, the list is almost endless. So there's a lot of things that we can do today that, again, 10 years ago weren't even possible. But all this change in the marketplace, when you take one step back, maybe 20,000 feet, I'm like, we see this convergence of the traditional building space. I'm like heating, cooling, fire, safety, security, connecting with the power world, with power distribution, with these renewable energy sources and storage requirements, through e-mobility into the mix, and everything that's happening with IoT and artificial intelligence. So all these worlds are starting to come together. And this is really, I'm like, to respond to this changing market that we see. This is really why we formed Smart Infrastructure. So I know that was a very long answer, I'm like, to a shorter question, but does that give you something?
No, that's great. I think any short, how would you summarize the difference between traditional infrastructure and smart infrastructure?
Yeah, traditional infrastructure, I mean, when you think about a building, was, I don't want to call it a dumb asset, but let's call it a passive asset. A passive asset that essentially caused write-offs and wasn't really doing anything. Smart infrastructure today communicates. Smart infrastructure is able to provide transparency. And hopefully when we fast forward in a couple of years, I'm like, is able to self-regulate, self-monitor. So I'm like, that's really the passive to active and proactive is where I would see the biggest difference.
So with ASCE just releasing a new infrastructure report card, what are the most important takeaways and why?
Yeah, so overall, I would say improvement is always great. So that overall the score went from a D to a C minus, I'm like, is a good thing. But I think nobody can be happy with overall a C minus. And when you look at the different categories, I'm like, that make up the infrastructure scorecard, I'm like, having schools, I think at a D or D minus hurts. I'm like, bridges aren't doing much better. So core infrastructure elements, I'm like, we really, as a nation, need to address and do something about. So from my perspective, I'm like, of course, I'm like, for smart infrastructure, the one that is closest, I'm like, to us is clearly, I'm like, the energy piece. And I think just the events in Texas just a couple of weeks ago showed us how vulnerable the grid is. And that really investments are needed and that we got to do something because our infrastructure in a lot of places is over 100 years old when it comes to power distribution. And there's just a lot of change that will hit like our power infrastructure.
Okay, yeah, speaking of investments, how can American infrastructure improve going forward so the next report in 4 more years shows greater improvement?
So again, I'm like zeroing in a little bit on the parts of the scorecard that are most relevant for us as a company. I talk about modernization needs to be key, but not just modernization in kind, but modernizing with the expectations of the future in mind. And when you think about like power or energy, I talked about resiliency, and a lot of utilities are working on that, getting more stability, storm hardening, like into the systems, both in transmission and distribution. Renewables, the push for decentralization, like, is something that we cannot ignore, and that comes with its own set of challenges in terms of new transmission infrastructure that is needed, in terms of maintaining grid stability. Like, with renewables coming on board, and like, renewables, like, a wind farm only generates power when there's wind, right? So like, there's new challenges for our utilities in managing this changing generation landscape. Decentralization, like, power is coming from different places. You have e-mobility, which will put a completely different demand on the power grid. Like, large consumers, like, right in the cities where you don't have power generation, a completely new set of requirements that our utilities are struggling with. So a lot of interesting things going on. But in order to address this effectively, I think there's a couple things needed. I'm like, first of all, I'm like, the scorecard has, 16, 17 different categories. And overall, to drive improvement, I'm like, we need focus and we need clear priorities of what we can tackle, because there is a lot of work to do. So once we know, I'm like, what we want to tackle and what we can tackle short term and near term, there needs to be a lot of collaboration and really a consensus-driven approach among the different stakeholders that have a say in driving infrastructure improvements. Funding is, for me, the next topic. And of course, we're talking about infrastructure bills, we're talking about the American Rescue Plan. There is the willingness from the federal government to help in this area. But I think there's also room for public-private partnerships. There's room for new funding models. More and more customers are looking for as-a-service solutions instead of essentially avoid capital outlay. So there's a lot of opportunity and need in that area. And last but not least, I think it's the use of digital tools. Because infrastructure, in my mind, still means heavy construction. And when you look at construction, the construction market in general is one of the least efficient that there is out there. And hasn't really innovated, it hasn't really digitalized. So adopting new tool landscapes, using BIM models, using 3D technologies, using digital tools to drive project management and document exchange, or ultimately even the use of digital twins to design and test and then prototype before anything is ever deployed. I think the adoption of these tools will go a long way in driving infrastructure enhancements quickly.
You brought up the American Rescue Plan. Could you tell me what you think its effects will be on infrastructure and engineering?
Yeah, overall, we have very, very high hopes on what is coming out of the White House at this point of time. So first of all, I just want to go on record and say that we really applaud the effort of the current administration when it comes to the vaccine rollout. And our own colleagues in the health space have done a good bit in that space when it comes to development of test kits and technology. But there's other aspects that we're really viewing very, very favorably as a company. Right now here, in smart infrastructure, one topic that we're very actively working on is to support the reopening of schools and higher educations. So the funds that are being made available there, first of all, they're direly needed. I heard, you have a wife in education too, so you know, what we're talking about. I have kids in school. So that is an area that we're very actively working on and helping our customers to find the right solutions and also find the ways to the funding that is being made available. But overall, the conversations around manufacturing, about what we can do as a company operating and then software solutions and digitalization there to help increase efficiencies in manufacturing through use of digital tools. Those are the areas that matter to us and where we have very high hopes based on what we're hearing out of Washington.
Are you optimistic that there might be additional infrastructure-specific legislation coming up in the near future?
Absolutely, absolutely. You just follow the press and just recent conversations. I think there's a lot of support for a larger infrastructure plan, from the broader U.S. business environment. Of course, the cost on top of the American Rescue Plan and other COVID relief bills, is something that needs to be addressed. But I think the time is now. There's willingness to invest in infrastructure, and at the end of the day, we still have unemployment at levels where we don't want it. So I think the time is right now, for funds to be made available and do the right thing for the country.
Okay, if there is a new infrastructure bill, what might be on Siemens and your division's wish list you might like to see in there?
A lot of different things. I would say highest priority at this point of time for us is really the support of e-mobility and the rollout of electrical vehicle charging. And the reason why I put this up here for legislation is because what we find when talking to utilities is that the current regulatory environment does not necessarily enable a fast-paced rollout of electrical vehicles. And I'm not necessarily talking about 3 car chargers here, 3 car chargers there. I'm talking about large fleets that are looking to go electrical. And when you think about it, starting with the US Postal Service over companies like in the logistics field like FedEx, UPS, there is plenty of companies that are looking to electrify right now. And the demand they will need to put on the grid will require investments, will potentially require rate pay adjustments that need to go through this regulatory process. And that is not a fast process today. So that's, I think, from my perspective, one of the key areas where I think a change in legislation could help. Then thinking further, we talked a little bit about resiliency. We talked about greener technology. So I think from that perspective, with more and more companies adopting firm sustainability targets and really declaring when they want to be neutral in terms of carbon footprint, there's a lot of momentum there. But again, also there, the current power infrastructure within the utility landscape play a key role. So that is the second area where I think more flexibility, an environment that opens the doors for more speed and for more targeted investments, wouldn't hurt. And then in the building space, that has been for us a key area, for quite a bit of time. But I think the pandemic has really taken that to new levels. And so we focused on the building space legislature in that realm, historically more from an energy efficiency perspective. But I think also now we need to think about health aspects, and whether that is ventilation, disinfection of buildings. That's something we can't ignore anymore.
Okay, if you were able to speak directly to our engineering audience, what might you tell them so that they can themselves improve the status and performance of U.S. infrastructure?
I'd say to the engineers that are in the current workforce is get ready for the digital wave that I think you won't be able to avoid. There's a lot of great tools already out there, and we got to deploy them if we want to be more efficient, if we want to keep the cost point of our large projects down. That means learning new tools and tricks. So take the opportunity, if you have them, to educate yourselves. And the other aspect is also, we know that a lot of our college graduates are not going into traditional engineering trades. They're not going into infrastructure construction. They're going into different areas. So I think all of us, and I'm an engineer myself, the best we can do is really encourage kids in high school or in the colleges right now to give traditional engineering, electrical, mechanical, civil a chance and make it interesting. Because I think through this new wave of digital tools, there's a lot of cool and innovative things coming. And they should be super attractive. And so not every graduate needs to go to Silicon Valley.
How do you see the status of infrastructure changing in technology, investment, and policy changes over the next 5 years?
That is a really good question. So ultimately, maybe let me answer this with a little bit of crystal ball and a lot of hope packed in there. So I truly hope that collectively infrastructure investments will become a priority and will get the focus that they really need. Of course, my big hope is that we see a lot of focus in the building space, in the sustainability realm, in the energy microgrid space. And if I had to predict, I think we'll see a lot of different approaches when it comes to infrastructure investments. I touched on digital tools earlier. I think infrastructure in general will need to become a lot smarter. That ultimately the expectations from the users of infrastructure into data availability, into real-time response, into the ability to operate in a green, sustainable way, those will be staples. We will see in the power side a lot more move towards decentralization. Microgrids that are one-offs today, that are more custom, location and application specific, maybe not research projects, but custom designed projects will go mainstream. So I would say those are the main areas I see from the infrastructure side. But if I were a betting man, I would also say that we see a lot more players emerge that will help with the alternate financing models. So we see this with our competitors. We ourselves have started a joint venture with Calibrant Energy to help our customers that don't have a lot of cash right now to avoid the capital outlay and really transform that into affordable monthly fees. Again, this as a service model. So I think we'll see a lot more of that because there's so much pent up demand. And somehow we got to find the funds to bring the changes that need to happen to reality.